Linux is totally different than Windows.
And totally awesome.
And totally awesome to a lot of people. For me, it's really hard to get used to, but we're going to talk about Linux. The reason we have it, how to get it, different features, shell commands, which is one of the things that makes this completely different. You type in commands instead of going through a GUI. And a little bit about securing user accounts and the like we've gone through with the other operating systems. So let's do a little review on Linux. Well, first off, why do we want to learn Linux? There are lots of companies that use it, and there's lots of things that use Linux. We just don't know about it. A lot of the systems in our cars, our robot vacuum at home uses Linux. It's used for a lot of web servers. So this non-GUI environment, remember a GUI is our graphic user interface, not having a clickable user interface can kind of sharpen your skills. When you have to type in commands, the commands have to be perfect for them to work. So sometimes that will help you sharpen up those skills and that attention to detail. And it does kind of give you a new way of thinking and looking at things because it's way different. Not necessarily in a bad way. So Linux is based on Unix. And in the 1970s, there was a guy named Ken Thompson at Bell Labs, wrote the precursor for Unix. Then in '84, we had our Unix-like version of the operating system. And then they came up with the Open System Foundation. In 1991, Linus Torvalds, who is the guy who invented Linux, it's named after him. That's a question on your Linux test. Wrote that first open source version. What does open source mean?
You can do what you want with it.
You can do what you want with it. Yeah. So it means that the code behind the operating system is available for anyone to look at. They can add, they can modify it. And that's one of the reasons we have different distributions of Linux. We'll talk about it in a second. So by 1994, there were many different versions of Linux that were freely available. I don't know if y'all have ever come across this channel. There's a channel on YouTube called Fast as Possible. This is their video for Linux Fast as Possible that gives you all kinds of information that the textbook takes like 12 pages to do. So I'm going to show you all that now. Wow.
You might be wondering why everyone's talking about Linux. What is it? There are two answers to this question. The first is the correct answer, and that is Linux is the core of an operating system. It's the essential software components which coordinate hardware, software, and user interaction. We call this the kernel. The second answer is a bit more vague. When some people will say Linux, what they're talking about are Linux-based operating systems, or in other words, operating systems built around the Linux kernel. So what is a Linux-based operating system? We usually call them Linux distributions, or distros for short. A typical Linux distro consists of the following: the Linux kernel, the core of the operating system. This usually includes most drivers, though not all. GNU tools and libraries. Command line utilities that allow for quick, easy usage and management of the system. The package manager, the way the operating system manages software installation, updating, and removal. Documentation, text documents which explain how software works and each application's various features. Usually a desktop environment, which is software that enables you to use your computer with a mouse and generates a graphical user interface. And finally, user applications, things like word processors, web browsers, and everything else. There are so many different Linux distributions out there. You might have heard of Ubuntu, Fedora, SteamOS, Arch, and others. Why are there so many Linux distributions? Well, that's a great question. The simplest answer is that because both the Linux kernel and software for Linux is free, anyone can make their own Linux distro to suit their tastes. And that's really what it boils down to. The Linux ecosystem is all about choice. You get to choose how you want your computer to behave. You get to choose what software comes pre-installed. And you get to choose how your desktop looks and what key combinations do what. Linux is up to you. With great choice comes great responsibility, but only if you want it. There are a ton of options out there for those who are uninitiated. Ubuntu and Linux Mint come to mind. These distros are designed for a comfortable end-user experience, foregoing the complicated initial setup that proved too high a hurdle for the average user. But the advantages of Linux, even Linux with proverbial training wheels, is enormous. Linux is free, both in terms of cost and in terms of freedom. You can do whatever you need to do without asking the gatekeeper's permission. Linux is stable. Blue screens of death just don't happen in a Linux environment. There are no registry errors, and things just seem to work without complaint. Linux is secure. Within the Linux world, it's pretty hard to find yourself victim to viruses or other malware. Linux is versatile. Ever wonder what OS your cable or satellite box is running? It probably is running Linux. How about your phone? Many old and new phones are powered by Linux as well. How about fancy cars or even fancier refrigerators? You guessed it, Linux. And Linux is cool. The Raspberry Pi runs Linux, and so does this rad PC-powered arcade cabinet. Valve's new gaming-specific operating system? Linux. And I'd call that a checkmate. Over the next couple of months, I'll be creating a series of videos aimed at explaining Linux, basic concepts like the term.
Okay, well, that's a little bit about that. So you can watch the rest of it. Now, some of the drawbacks of Linux. There's no centralized support. So that means that when something breaks on Linux, there's no patches that update security issues, there's no tech support to call. It is up to you to figure out how to fix it. Now, it breaks a lot less often, but it does break. It's not foolproof, right? The choice of GUIs can be confusing. Different distros, as they call them, can look completely different. So if you install a new distro, sometimes you have to figure out how the GUI looks. Whereas if you go from Windows 7 to Windows 10, the start menu's in the same place and things are still kind of called the same. But with Linux, things are going to be a little different. There's limited software. For example, you can't install Microsoft Word or Excel like you would use for your schoolwork on Linux, because it just doesn't come compatible for that. You would have to get some sort of app store component that's like Word, and then save your document and make it where it would open in Word so the instructor could use it. So there's some workarounds and stuff that have to be done. It's not quite as straightforward as just opening up Word, typing it, and saving it and uploading it into Moodle. The drivers and things may not be available because there's limited hardware support. It's a little more complex, especially considering you have to type in a lot of things with the command line interface. So there's some drawbacks. If you want to find software for Linux, you can go, all these screenshots are going to be Ubuntu because that's the particular Linux distribution we're going to be looking at. There's lots of different ones, and throughout your TSTC career, you're going to use other ones. You'll use Kali in my security class for sure. So if you want to find software, you've got a menu bar across the top. The dock is to the left. Normally we would see it towards the bottom on Windows-based systems and on the Macs, but it's over towards the left. Your notifications are in the top right-hand corner, and this is the Ubuntu Software Center. So this is the app store for this particular distribution of Linux. So on your desktop, there's many different ways of distributions that are available to put on your desktop. So you can kind of select the one that matches your needs. For example, do you want a GUI that you can click things on, or do you just want to be able to type in commands? There's a different distribution for those things. How quick and easy is the setup? Is there some sort of software that's included in that? Kali Linux that we use in the security classes has a bunch of penetration testing. So you might have a computer with this particular distribution of Linux, plug it up into someone's network, and then find all the holes in their network, so then they can pay you to fix it, right? Ideally. There's whether or not you need a live image. A live image is burning the operating system to a CD and then just starting it up from the CD. So the changes that you make are not necessarily permanent. You can just restart the computer and have it back the way it was. And there's different things. Ubuntu, do you want Fedora? Again, it depends on what you're using the distribution for. So if you want to install it on your desktop, it's very easy. There is a distribution site. You can go and download it. You save what's called the ISO file. All the files that we've used for Windows 7, 8.1, 10, they've all been an ISO file. You can create a bootable disk, test that disk, by booting it, and then install it on a physical PC or a VM. We're going to be, of course, installing it on a VM. And the textbook is going to show us how to do that. I've got a couple of the links for y'all on that. After you install Linux, you need to update it just like any other operating system. It can have updates on it. Updating can be time consuming, but we're used to that, right? So let's look at the Ubuntu GUI. When you log into it, here is where your password, this is the username, where you would type in the password, and if you want to log in as a guest, if that's enabled, you can use the GUI to do that. The Unity desktop is what we're seeing with this on the left-hand side. So the desktop bar is at the top of the screen, and if you mouse over it, you get this separate menu that pops up that gives you different options as far as what you can do with whatever is happening on the screen. Then we have the Unity launcher, which is kind of like our start menu in Windows. Unity is the name of this particular GUI, so when you see Unity come up, that just means the look and feel of this particular distribution. So here's what our apps look like, being able to open up the different apps within Ubuntu. If we want to search, we can do that by clicking up here for the search utility, and it'll search through all your applications, all your documents, just like we would do in Windows. Every user has what's called a home directory. This is like the user folder that we have on Windows systems. So the user has full control of that home directory. They can't make changes in other people's directories because they're not that user, just like we have in Windows. The path describes the location, and we often refer to this first / as the root, so it's the root directory. And then all the other / are different separate directions. Everything to Linux is a file. That's a test question too. Everything is a file. So if you're making a user, you're adding a user to the user file. If you're adding a file, you're adding it to the home file, right? So here's the different directories and what they look like, and each one has its own purpose and its own content within it. So again, we have the root that we just talked about. Temporary files always go in /tmp. Configuration files always go in /etc. So you can browse to these different things and see all the files that make up the operating system as it is at that time. When you update Ubuntu, you can go to the Update Manager, and it will show you a list of all the possible updates, and you can check off which ones you want and install, just like we were doing in Windows. We have a system settings, which is like our control panel or our preferences that we've seen before, though that we can go through and change settings if we need to. If you want to change the desktop, you can just right-click into the desktop and click Change Desktop Background. You can change some different behaviors, the brightness, the lock settings, does it make you ask for a password again, things like that. And then there's some ease of use things, like for someone who is maybe hearing or visually impaired, that's also built into Ubuntu. So you can see they tried to make it very friendly, it's very customizable. If you want to end a session, you log out, which means you click the gear at the very top right-hand corner and go to the log out. And you can see this is kind of like our initial start menu of where can we go next. You can have different users, so you can click on the name of the new user and have their profile come up. If you want to start or shut down, you can go to the gear and click and hit shut down, so you'll either get the ability to restart or shut down from there. Okay, now all that is fairly, it may look different and it may be in a different place, but it's a lot of the same things that we're used to seeing. Now, when we get to the Linux command line interface, everything gets a little bit different. So here we have the terminal window. So you can see that Jane is the user that's logged in because it says Jane @ Jane. And this is a VirtualBox VM. So this is a terminal window. This is just like our command prompt that we would use for, any command within Windows. So if you click on this dash search tool, which is what that is, and type the word terminal, you get this terminal window that pops up. So each line begins with a command, then a space, then any options for that, It doesn't matter what order you type things in sometimes. It will still go ahead and execute the command, and you can put a space between each option that you're adding. So I'll show you an example of that in a second. So if you can proceed to short options with a hyphen, these things are not necessarily important that you know for the test, but we will be doing some command within Ubuntu where you will see these things in your labs. And some commands are followed by the name of the object, like add this to this file, and y'all will do examples of that. If you want to see the contents of a directory, you can use what the ls command, which I always think of list. The list command, list everything in the current directory. Here's an example of using a command. There's one dash and then there's the letter A. So that is a listing of all items in the current directory. But you can see you have more, you have some things that are system files that might normally be hidden that show up in the current directory. So the prompt shows the user that's currently logged on, and then you have your command and then your options that come along with it. This is the same thing as clicking on Windows Explorer and seeing a graphical list, right? You can kind of combine those commands together. So here's an example. Now we have more than one argument. We have an A and an L. So we use the ls command, the list command, but we have two options behind it that show a listing of all the items in the current directory and the long information. So basically showing more detailed information. So instead of physically going and trying to find the sort function and then sorting to see what we want, we're just typing in one more letter. And now you can see the read and write permissions. We'll talk about those in a minute. The different user and the time date. So you get a longer list, a more detailed list. The man ls command shows you the manual page for the ls command. So man is like the word for saying, show me the help file so I know what to do with this command. So this is showing, hey, this is what you can do with the ls command. And these are all the arguments that you can add to the end of it so that you can find out more things. And you'll be using the man command in your labs. Every single thing that's ever been typed into command line shows up in the --history file. So you can scroll through those commands and reuse them if you want to. And you can tap up or down to see the previous command that you typed in, just like you can in DOS today. If you're doing anything with Cisco, you know, you can start typing in a command and hit tab and it will complete it for you. This does the same thing using the tab key. So this, if you're starting a file or a directory name and you hit tab, it will go ahead and finish it for you so you have less typing to do. There's some commands. Here's date, where you can set the date of the operating system, and then where you can set the time as well. One of the kind of annoying things about Linux is it doesn't give you a lot of feedback on your commands. If your command was successful, it won't tell you anything. But if you mess something up, it's really quick to fuss at you. It's quick to say, no, there's no such thing as that. So you can't change directory documents because there's no such thing as documents. Because it wasn't typed in properly up here. So only if there's an error will it come up and talk to you about anything. For file management, you can change directory, and you'll notice a lot of this is the same as DOS if you've used that before because it's all built on Unix. mkdir to make a directory, pwd, print the working directory. For the ls command, we use a lot because we want to see the contents within a document, within a folder. So here's some of the different switches, and we've seen the A and the L be used. But you can also use sorting and things like that. And classify different kinds of documents. So here's a listing of everything that's in the /etc directory. There's a lot, right? So the ls command will default to the current directory, but you can reroute it by just saying, no, show me this. Don't show me the current thing, show me this folder or this file. And then if you did that with the -L, you would get the more details like that. And here's how you change the current directory. You just say change directory, CD, space, and then type in the directory and it will come up. If you want to change back to the home directory, you can use that's a tilde. I know we don't use the tilde very much, but it's over there by the escape key. If you want to know what directory you're in, because maybe you're typing in a bunch of commands and you got lost, you can use PWD, which is the present working directory. So it'll show on the monitor, oh, this is where you are. Sometimes, working a command line, you can get lost. If we want to move to the parent directory, basically go up a level, we can use CD space dot dot and it will go up one level. Again, if you're familiar with DOS, then you did a lot of this because it's the same.
DOS.
My first computer just had DOS. We didn't have Windows back then. So
command. When you used to log in.
we're not going to talk about what year that was. So here is a sample of what this looks like, running the LS and showing, okay, I use the option of showing me all the things that start with a C or start with a D. So if you don't want to scroll through a gigantic list of things, you can use a little bit to sort. The asterisk or the wildcard replaces all the characters from the point in which you place them to the very end. So it's literally saying if it starts with a C or D, and I don't care what other characters come in behind it. So there's another way that you can do that. You can create a directory, mkdir, so you're creating a directory called sales and you're creating a directory called marketing. In this case, it doesn't come up and say, your directories have been completed, so you might have to use the list command to come up and say, okay, show me that those directories worked, because it's not really giving you positive feedback. You can copy files as well with CP, copy file to that directory, and then it will copy it to the user's home directory. Okay, so I'm not going to expect you to know a ton about command line. There's a few commands that we talked about, the man, the ls, that are really big ones, but let's talk about securing a Linux desktop. So we talked about every account has a home directory, just like we have a user folder in Windows. Their name is assigned to that. They have full control of their home directory, but they can't get into other people's directories because they don't have permissions. So there's also a root account. So the root is the all-powerful administrator. We don't use the root account unless we absolutely have to, because with great power comes great responsibility. Right, Christian?
That's correct.
That's right. So that account is disabled by default. You can temporarily use the root if you need to override something or to do something that maybe it's not letting you do. So you can create user accounts, which we'll be doing in our labs. We can give credentials so that they become an administrator as well. If you want to temporarily be an administrator, so you just want to be an administrator for this one command. You don't want to like log out, log back in, and go through a lot of mess. You can use what's called sudo, which is short for super user do. So super user do, change password. So you might see something like that. When you're trying to do something that's an administrator thing, but you just want to do that one thing and then go back to your privilege level that you normally have. You get root privileges for 5 minutes and then it times out. So here's an example of that. Sudo app-get install finger. So that's actually installing an application from the command line. So perhaps this person did not have the authority to do that. They used the sudo command and now they do. Yes, sir?
Can you extend the time in which you root?
Not without modifying the kernel,
Okay.
because that's built into the OS.
Okay, so you cannot modify 5 minutes.
You could, if you wanted to dig into the kernel and change it, sure.
So by default it's 5 minutes.
But by default, it's 5 minutes.
Thank you.
Okay, so shell commands, things that we might use to type in having to do with users. So you could say user add and then put in a name and it would add that user and add their own home directory to the system. You can delete, you can change a user's password, or you can use the finger service to find a username. Creating with user add, y'all be doing this in the lab. So here we go, sudo user add actually put their password into the prompt and their username. So this is creating a user account for Ashley Phoenix with the username A Phoenix and the password PA22W0R capital D. So typing that in through command line instead of going in through a GUI, again, that's a different way of thinking. You can change your password, your own password, by using the password command and then just providing it with a password that you want. Or you can change a password for another account by using that sudo command. Normally you wouldn't be able to change other people's password, but you can if you're a super user, and then enter that new password. Now, when you're entering in passwords on pretty much any Linux distro that I think I've ever worked with, it doesn't actually put characters on the screen, so at first it looks like it's not taking anything. It's just like Cisco. Cisco does the same thing. So it looks like nothing's happening, but actually it's accepting your keystroke when that happens. You can delete users. You can say sudo user down and put the username. It's going to delete all the files in their home directory. So make sure that you've moved those files first if you actually want to keep them. Otherwise, they're going to go right along with the username. And here's an example of files and folder permissions. So we've done a list, and we can see this little weird codey thing right here, drwxr-xr-x. So that actually is how they're showing permissions. This is who can read, who can write, and who can execute that file. And they do it in kind of an interesting way. So whether you can read, write, or execute is assigned a numerical value, and then all those values add up to something. And there's no way they can add up to the same number. So like if you can read and execute, that's a 5. If you can read, write, and execute, that's a 7. So they look at that user compared to what that numerical value is to determine what you can do to the file, which is kind of interesting. Like if you have a value 6, you can read and write, but you can't execute, and it knows that just because of those access mode numbers, which I think is an interesting approach to permissions.